The night Harlow found the body, she was already 3 hours late, filing the quarterly ledgers. She'd been crouched behind the loading dock of the Meridian building on Richmond Street West, cigarette burned down to her knuckles, cross-referencing paper invoices against the digital entries on her laptop. The numbers never matched on the first pass. They never matched on the second, either. Not because anyone was incompetent, but because the men who ran these operations didn't believe in clean arithmetic. Clean arithmetic left trails. Harlow's job was to make the trails look like something else. A logistics consulting firm, a property management group, a holding company registered out of Alberta with a mailing address that didn't exist anymore. She was good at her job. She was also exhausted, underpaid, and increasingly convinced that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment, somewhere around age 22. The body wasn't her problem. She told herself that when she saw it. She told herself that again when she recognized the jacket. Italian wool, charcoal grey, the kind of jacket that cost more than her monthly rent on a building she shared with 2 other women, and a radiator that screamed every night at 2 in the morning. She told herself that a third time when she realized the jacket was still moving. Not a body then, a man, slumped against the alley wall 4 meters from the dock entrance, one hand pressed flat against his rib cage, breath coming in the short, controlled bursts of someone who had done this before and did not intend to panic about it. Harlow looked at him for a long moment. She looked back at her laptop. She looked at him again. "If you're going to help me," he said, without opening his eyes, "now would be preferable." His voice was low and even, like someone reading a weather report, like bleeding in an alley at 11:45 on a Thursday was a minor scheduling inconvenience. She knew that voice. Every person who worked in the orbit of the Vasquez Syndicate knew that voice, even if they'd never been in the same room with its owner. You learned it the same way you learned to recognize the sound of a car backfiring versus something else. Not because anyone taught you, but because your body figured it out on its own and filed it somewhere primal and permanent. Harlow closed her laptop. His name was Rourke. Just Rourke, always Rourke, the way certain things only needed one word: storm, fire, fault. She'd never spoken to him directly. She was 3 levels below direct. She sent her reports through a man named Ezra, who sent them to someone she'd never met, who presumably sent them somewhere closer to the top. She'd seen Rourke twice, once at a distance across a parking garage in Etobicoke, once through a window on the 14th floor of a building she wasn't supposed to be in. Both times he'd been doing what powerful men always seemed to be doing, standing very still while other people moved urgently around him. He was not standing still now. "I have a first aid kit," she heard herself say. "In the car, get it. Not please, not thank you, not I would appreciate it. Just get it, flat and certain, the way you talk to people when it had never once occurred to you that they might say no." Harlow got it. She came back to find him still in the same position, though he'd moved his hand away from his ribs long enough to check something on his phone and put it back. The screen light caught the side of his face. He was older than she'd thought, mid-40s probably, with lines around his eyes that hadn't come from laughing, a scar along his jaw that had healed badly, or maybe just honestly, dark hair going silver at the temples. He looked like a man who had been handsome once, and then decided it wasn't useful enough to maintain. "How bad?" she asked, crouching down to his level. "Inconvenient." She pulled back the edge of his jacket without asking permission. He let her, which surprised her. There was a wound in his side, a knife wound, she thought. Not a bullet, because the shape was wrong for a bullet, and she had, in her 2 years with this organization, learned more about wound shapes than she had ever intended to. It was still bleeding, but not badly, the kind of bleeding that looked frightening and was actually survivable if you weren't stupid about it. "You need stitches. I'm aware, I can't do stitches. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him. "What are you asking me to do?" He finally opened his eyes. They were dark, very dark, and completely calm, which was more unsettling than any expression of pain would have been. He looked at her the way you looked at a column of numbers, taking inventory, assigning values, calculating what she was worth to him in this specific moment. "Drive," he said. Harlow had a 2019 Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a check engine light that had been on for so long she'd started to think of it as a feature. She had in the back seat her work bag, 3 empty coffee cups from Tim Hortons, and a first aid kit she'd bought at a Shoppers Drug Mart after her 2nd month on the job, because something in her gut had said you're going to need this eventually. She hadn't expected eventually to look like this. She got him into the passenger seat. He didn't lean on her, didn't grab her arm, didn't make a sound. He moved like someone with a very clear and private understanding of his own body. What it could take, what it was going to cost him later, what he could afford to feel right now versus what needed to be deferred. She recognized that kind of economy. She'd been running it herself for years. Where? She asked. He gave her an address in Forest Hill. She didn't say anything about the neighborhood. She merged onto the Gardiner and kept her eyes on the road and told herself very quietly and very firmly that she was not in trouble. She was probably in trouble. The house was large in the way that old Toronto money expressed itself. Not showy, not glass and steel and visible ambition, but brick and stone and a certainty so settled it didn't need to perform. Iron gates, a long driveway, grounds that were dark but immaculate. She pulled up to the front entrance, and a man appeared almost immediately, the kind of appearing that meant he'd been watching the cameras. Rourke said 2 words to him. The man disappeared and came back with 2 others, and between the 3 of them they got Rourke inside without drama. Harlow sat in her car in the driveway and waited for someone to tell her what she was supposed to do. Nobody did. After 5 minutes, she got out. Nobody stopped her. She followed them inside because she didn't know what else to do, and because something about leaving felt more dangerous than staying. The foyer was marble and dark wood, a chandelier that was lit low, oil paintings on the walls that didn't look decorative. They looked like warnings. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her jacket and waited. A woman came down the stairs. Not young, maybe 60, with white hair pulled back severely and reading glasses pushed up on her head like she'd been interrupted. She looked at Harlow the way people look at something unexpected they are not yet sure is a problem. "You brought him in," she said. "He asked me to drive. He's lucky you were there." "I was working," Harlow said. "I'm always working. I didn't have a choice." The woman considered this. "Margaret is in," she started, then stopped herself. "Come with me." Harlow didn't ask where they were going. She followed the woman down a hallway that smelled like old books and something medicinal, and into a room that was clearly meant to be a study, but had been converted, temporarily and practically, into something closer to a field hospital. A man she didn't know was already working on Rourke's side, hands gloved, instruments laid out with an efficiency that meant this wasn't his first time here either. Rourke was sitting upright in a leather chair that had been moved to the center of the room. His jacket was off. His shirt had been cut away on one side. He was very pale and very composed, and he was looking at Harlow with an expression she couldn't read. "You stayed," he said. "You didn't tell me to leave. Most people would have left anyway." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. More like the idea of one filed away for later. She found a chair against the wall and sat down. She didn't know why she stayed. She told herself it was because the alternative was driving back to the office and finishing the ledgers, and somehow that seemed worse. She told herself it was because leaving a man bleeding in a chair felt wrong in a way she couldn't argue herself out of. She told herself it was professional. She worked for his organization. Loosely, she had obligations. She was covering herself. She was good at telling herself things. The doctor, or whatever he was, worked in silence. The woman with the white hair stood near the door, with her arms folded, and said nothing. Rourke stared at the middle distance with the focused blankness of someone doing a great deal of internal calculation and keeping all of it off his face. After 40 minutes, the doctor stepped back and said something quiet. Rourke nodded once. The doctor packed his things and left. The woman with white hair looked at Rourke. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that Harlow couldn't translate, the compressed shorthand of people who had known each other a very long time. "Leave us," Rourke said. The woman's expression didn't change. She looked at Harlow briefly, as if assessing something. Then she left, pulling the door almost closed behind her. The room was very quiet. Harlow Breck, Rourke said. She hadn't told him her name. Accounts reconciliation, he continued. Eastern Ontario portfolio and 2 shells out of Calgary. You've been with us 26 months. You submitted the Q2 report 4 days early. Every quarter the numbers don't change by waiting, she said. No, he agreed. They don't. She waited. You didn't call anyone, he said. No, you could have. When you found me, you had a phone, you had options. She thought about this. You would have known, she said, eventually, that I'd made a call. Yes, and then I'd be a loose end. Yes, so no, she said. I didn't call. He studied her, that same inventory look, but slower this time, less urgent, like he was reading something a second time to make sure he'd understood it right. You're not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm afraid of being stupid, she said. I'm not afraid of you specifically. The silence stretched. Outside, somewhere distant, a car moved down a street. The house breathed around them, old wood and old stone, the particular stillness of a place that had kept a lot of secrets and expected to keep more. I have a function on Saturday, Rourke said finally. Charity gala. The Sinclair Foundation at the Royal York. I was supposed to bring someone. Harlow looked at him very carefully. You're not serious. I'm always serious. You were stabbed 3 hours ago. Yes, in an alley on Richmond Street. I'm aware of where. And you're asking me to. I'm telling you, he said, that I need someone who can be in a room full of people who will try to read her and find nothing. Someone who knows how to keep numbers and not move her face. Saturday, 7 o'clock. You'll be paid. I'm already paid. You'll be paid more. She should have said no. She knew how to say no. She'd been saying no her whole life. To her father who wanted her to disappear quietly. To the men at her first firm who wanted her to file and fetch coffee and not notice the discrepancies. To every person who had ever looked at her and decided she was a minor entry on a spreadsheet rather than someone who balanced the whole thing. Saturday, she said. He nodded. I'm going back to finish the ledgers, she said, standing. Leave them until morning. They need to be filed by 9. I'll tell Ezra. She looked at him. This man, this particular weight in a leather chair, this collection of power and injury, and something she was carefully not naming. He looked back at her, and for just a moment the calculation in his eyes softened into something adjacent to exhaustion, something real and very tired and quickly hidden. Thank you, he said. Quiet. Like it cost him, she said. I was just doing what made sense. She left. She drove back to her apartment in Parkdale and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, drinking cold tea and trying to figure out what, exactly, had just happened to her life. She couldn't find the right column for it. Saturday came the way Saturdays always came, too fast and without adequate warning. She'd bought a dress she couldn't really afford from a consignment shop on Queen West. Deep green, long, structured enough to feel like armor. She did her own hair and her own makeup, and she looked in the mirror for a long time before she decided she was done looking and put on her coat. The car arrived at 6:45. Not a car she recognized, not a driver she recognized. She got in anyway. The Royal York in the early evening was the kind of beautiful that made you aware of how much work went into looking effortless. Crystal and candlelight, black tie, the particular hum of money talking to money. Harlow had been in rooms like this before, briefly, peripherally, in the years when she'd worked at the accounting firm, and occasionally been sent to deliver documents. She'd never belonged in them. She didn't belong in this one either, technically. But she had spent enough of her life being somewhere she didn't belong that she had stopped letting it show on her face. Rourke was waiting near the entrance. He was in a black suit, moving carefully in the way of someone managing discomfort without advertising it. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something in his expression did a thing she decided not to examine. You look appropriate, he said. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. He almost smiled. The same almost as before, the same filing away. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked into the room. The night was long, and she was good at it. She learned the names quickly. The Sinclair family, old money from Rosedale. their foundation funneling charitable dollars in ways that were technically legal and structurally interesting. A city councillor whose handshake lasted too long and whose eyes moved too fast. 3 men from a development company that Harlow recognized from the Calgary shell she reconciled every quarter. She noted them without noting them. She smiled when smiling was required. She held a glass of white wine she barely drank and stood close enough to Rourke that people read her as relevant, without her having to explain herself. At one point a woman approached, tall, angular, carrying herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had expected to be somewhere specific tonight and found someone else there instead. She looked at Harlow for a moment too long. Then she looked at Rourke. "Callum," she said. Harlow registered the first name like a small shock. "Nobody called him that," he said. "Nothing else." The woman's eyes moved back to Harlow. "Cool, appraising, a calculation being run in real time. I didn't know you were bringing someone," she said. "Plans change," he said. "They do," she agreed. She smiled, and the smile didn't land anywhere near her eyes. "I'm sure we'll speak later." She moved away. Harlow watched her go. "Former business associate," Rourke said quietly, beside her. "She's not here for the charity," Harlow said. A pause. "No, and she's not happy you're here." "No. Do I need to be worried?" He looked at her sideways. "Are you the kind of person who gets worried?" "I'm the kind of person who asks the question so I can plan accordingly." "Stay close," he said. "That's all." She stayed close. Near midnight, when the room had thinned and the music had gotten quieter, they stood on the mezzanine level looking down at what remained of the gala. He had a glass of water. She had finally surrendered the white wine for a club soda. Her heels were doing what heels always did at the end of an evening, but she didn't shift her weight, didn't reach down, didn't give that inch. "You're from here," he said. Not a question. "Oshawa," she said. "Close enough family?" Not really. He absorbed this without pressing it. She appreciated that. "You were going to leave," he said. 2 months ago. You submitted a notice to Ezra." She looked at him. "Ezra told you that. Ezra tells me everything. It's his function." A pause. "I told him to offer you 12% more." She had wondered about that. The raise had appeared in her account without explanation or conversation, and she had filed the question of why under things she probably didn't want the answer to. "And if I'd left anyway?" she asked. "You didn't. That's not an answer." He looked at her. In the low light of the mezzanine, with the distant sound of the orchestra and the careful distance they were both maintaining between themselves and what was actually happening, his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Something unguarded, just for a second. Something that looked like the answer to a question she hadn't finished asking. "The numbers don't change by waiting," he said quietly. She'd said that to him days ago, in the dark of that study. He'd kept it, filed it somewhere and brought it back. She didn't know what to do with that. "I should get home," she said. "I'll have the car brought around." "I can take a cab, Harlow." She stopped. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking down at the room below, at the thinning crowd and the candlelight and the city night beyond the tall windows. His hands were on the railing. In profile he looked like something carved. Something that had been holding the same position for a very long time and might have forgotten how to move. "The woman," he said. "Ingrid. She's the reason Thursday happened." Harlow went very still. "She's connected to a group that's been working against our interests in the East for 18 months. Thursday was a message." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you drove me home," he said. "Because you sat in my study for 40 minutes and didn't ask me a single question you didn't need to. Because when I told you Saturday you said fine and you showed up in the right dress, and you handled this room better than anyone I've brought here in 4 years." He paused. "Because I'm trying to figure out what to do with you." She understood then, very clearly, that he wasn't talking about professionally. She understood also that she was not equipped for this, that she had spent 29 years building a set of walls that were specifically designed for this situation, and that standing here in her green dress on this mezzanine, she was aware of every single one of them. "I file numbers," she said, "for your organization. Through Ezra, that's what I am to you." He finally turned to look at her. Is it? She didn't answer. She couldn't find the right one. There's a car waiting, he said. Go home. Sleep. Monday morning the reports will be there, and Ezra will forward them, and everything will be exactly what it was. And if I don't want it to be exactly what it was. The words came out before she had authorized them. She heard them land in the air between them and thought about taking them back and decided against it, because she was tired, and because she had been doing the sensible thing her entire life, and because she was standing on a mezzanine in the Royal York at midnight with a man who had memorized her words, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at her for a long time. Monday, he said. Come to the house, not through Ezra. For what? To talk. She held his gaze. People like you don't just talk. No, he said, but I'm going to try. She took the car home. She sat in the back seat in the dark, watching the city go past, the late lights of Yonge Street, the quiet of her neighborhood coming up around her, and she thought about the way his face had looked for that one unguarded second. And she thought about the numbers she had been running all her life, the careful accounting of risk versus safety, cost versus gain, what you give and what you get, and whether the ledger ever balances. It never balanced. She knew that. She'd always known that. She thought about Monday. She didn't cancel it.